The sound of engines, distant, uneven, growing stronger. A haze of smoke drifts across an airfield outside Berlin. It is August 1940, and the Luftwaffe reigns supreme. Across Europe, German bombers carve black scars into the skies above London, Warsaw, and Rotterdam. The world watches in awe and terror as Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the German Air Force, stands before a cheering crowd, his chest gleaming with medals, his confidence absolute. He smirks when he hears the report. Across the Atlantic, America, still half asleep in its neutrality, still shackled by depression, has announced a plan. 50,000 planes a year. Göring laughs. 50,000? He scoffs. They can't even make enough cars right now. In his mind, the idea is absurd. Germany's aircraft industry, built on years of militarization, has already conquered the skies. The Americans, he believes, are dreamers, soft, unfocused, dependent on assembly lines that make refrigerators, not fighters. To Göring, air power is a weapon of discipline and will, not production quotas. To him, the idea of a democracy outbuilding a totalitarian state is a joke. But beneath that laughter, something was stirring in the American heartland. In Detroit, the clatter of machinery from idle car factories echoed through empty floors. Men and women stood in unemployment lines, reading headlines about Europe's burning cities. In Seattle, a small company named Boeing was experimenting with all-metal bombers, while in San Diego, Consolidated Aircraft was testing a massive new design called the B-24 Liberator. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt looked across the Atlantic and saw more than a war. He saw a test of civilization itself. When Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 planes a year, even his own advisors doubted him. The U.S. military possessed barely 3,000 aircraft, many outdated, underpowered, or obsolete. The industrial base was vast but uncoordinated. The nation's largest airplane factory had never built more than a few hundred planes a year. To many it seemed delusional. Yet Roosevelt's words weren't about arithmetic. They were a declaration of faith in American ingenuity, resourcefulness, and unity. A democracy, he believed, could fight tyranny not through fear, but through creation. As Europe plunged deeper into chaos, the United States began to awaken. Factories once meant for automobiles, washing machines, and typewriters would soon roar with the production of bombers, fighters, and transport planes. Designers, engineers, and line workers would transform the tools of daily life into the engines of global war. But in 1940, that transformation was still unthinkable. The contradiction lay at the heart of the story. The world believed dictatorships were efficient and democracies were slow. Germany's war machine, forged through control and fear, seemed unstoppable. America, divided and uncertain, appeared too soft, too late, too free. And yet, hidden within that freedom lay the power Göring could never comprehend. The collective imagination of millions of ordinary people. Cut to archival footage. American factories, smokestacks, trains rolling east. By the winter of 1941, vast construction projects had begun across the United States. Fields became runways. Warehouses became hangars. In places like Willow Run, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company began building the largest factory in the world, designed not to make cars but bombers. Its founder, Henry Ford, though skeptical of war, was drawn into the national effort by a sense of challenge, mass production of aircraft, something no one had ever attempted. At the same time, Boeing expanded along the Pacific coast, producing the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress. Douglas, Lockheed, North American Aviation. Each pushed the limits of technology, merging competition with patriotism. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe would soon fill with machines bearing stars and stripes. While Göring laughed, America was quietly building a miracle. Men who once riveted car doors now riveted wings. Women, housewives, clerks, and secretaries stepped onto factory floors for the first time, welding, assembling, testing engines. Farmers shipped aluminum. Miners pulled copper from the ground for miles of wiring. Every rivet, every bolt, every gallon of aviation fuel was a defiance, a silent answer to a sneer from across the ocean. And above it all, in Roosevelt's speeches and in factory slogans, a single idea echoed. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. The contrast was as much moral as it was mechanical. The Luftwaffe's strength lay in fear, hierarchy, and the will of one man. America's strength would come from volunteers, innovation, and belief in each other. The German war machine sought control. The American war engine thrived on chaos turned to order, imagination forged into steel. By 1942, as Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war, the laughter stopped. Göring's Luftwaffe, stretched thin over Europe and Africa, began to meet an enemy it could not intimidate. The endless hum of American industry. Slow pan, archival montage of factory floors, workers, bombers taking off in formation. Each month, more planes rolled out than any empire had ever dreamed of building. By 1943, America wasn't just meeting Roosevelt's goal, it was doubling it. The Ford plant at Willow Run was producing a B-24 every hour. At peak capacity, 96,000 aircraft were built in a single year. The sound of engines, the sound Göring once thought his alone, now thundered across two oceans. This was not merely the triumph of machinery. It was the triumph of belief. Belief that free men and women given purpose could outwork empires. Belief that democracy could be as disciplined as dictatorship and more enduring. Belief that the mockery of one man could awaken the resolve of millions. The story of Göring's laughter, and America's answer, is not just about planes. It is about the moment when ridicule met resolve, when arrogance collided with imagination, and when the quiet hum of assembly lines became the roar that would change history. Fade out, slow orchestral score builds to silence. Thesis statement. This is the story of how mockery became momentum, how free people transformed insult into industry, and how the true power of a nation is measured not by its armies, but by its will to create. Fade in, archival audio, typewriters, factory noise, ticking clocks. 1. Build up, the impossible promise. In the summer of 1940, while German bombers scorched London in the Battle of Britain, America remained a land of uneasy peace. The radio carried Roosevelt's speeches, but most Americans were not yet ready for war. Isolationism ran deep. The Great Depression had left factories idle and morale thin. The U.S. Army Air Corps, barely more than a fledgling branch, possessed only a few thousand outdated aircraft, most incapable of combat against the Luftwaffe's advanced fleet. Inside the War Department, generals spoke in cautious tones. How can we build 50,000 planes, one asked, when we've never built more than 3,000 in a year? Even William Knudsen, a Danish-born industrialist who had risen through the ranks of General Motors, was uncertain. But Roosevelt summoned him to the White House with a simple instruction. You built cars for peace. Now you'll build planes for freedom. Knudsen understood something Göring never would. America's factories were not military but adaptable. The same production lines that had churned out millions of automobiles could be reimagined for war. Still, in 1940 this vision bordered on fantasy. The United States lacked the supply chains, the trained workers, the precision tooling, everything that Germany had spent a decade constructing. And yet, as Göring boasted of Luftwaffe invincibility, Roosevelt quietly planted the seed of a revolution. Cut to black and white footage, Midwest fields, factories under construction. In places like Willow Run, Michigan, Fort Worth, Texas, and Seattle, Washington, land was cleared, concrete poured, and skeletal hangars began to rise. America's sleeping giant, as Japanese Admiral Yamamoto would later call it, was stirring awake. It began not with soldiers but engineers and draftsmen. Blueprints unfurled across drafting tables. Measurements were recalculated, materials were rationed. Men like Donald Douglas, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, and William Boeing, visionaries of the pre-war aviation industry, were now central players in a national mobilization unlike anything in history. Douglas's DC-3, once a luxury passenger plane, was reimagined into the C-47 Skytran, the workhorse of air transport. Kindleberger's P-51 Mustang would become the fighter that turned the tide in Europe. And Boeing's Flying Fortress, the B-17, grew from a prototype into a symbol of unstoppable air power. The machine that built victory. SFX, industrial roar, the rhythm of engines starting up. In 1941, before America even entered the war, the nation had begun transforming itself into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories once filled with automobile parts now gleamed with rows of wing assemblies and fuselage molds. Ford Motor Company, once the proud builder of Model Ts, took on an audacious project: mass-produce bombers the same way it built cars. At the Willow Run plant, designed by Ford engineer Charles Sorensen, every step of the production process was broken down into a continuous line of motion: stamping, riveting, welding, wiring, until a complete B-24 Liberator emerged at the other end. It was not smooth at first. Early aircraft came off the line incomplete or defective. Logistics snarled under the weight of inexperience. But America's advantage was persistence. Where a dictator's factory demanded perfection through punishment, a democracy achieved it through innovation and collaboration. Each problem became a puzzle. Each failure a lesson. Within a year, Ford was producing bombers faster than anyone believed possible. One every 63 minutes at its peak. The plant ran 24 hours a day, lit by a sea of fluorescent lamps that turned night into day. Workers joked that Willow Run was the plant that never sleeps. Cutio, scene, Boeing plant, Seattle. The same transformation echoed across the nation. Boeing's facilities expanded along the Duwamish River, building the B-17 in such numbers that they coined the phrase, fortresses in formation before they ever take off. North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, built the P-51 Mustang, a plane that would escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Douglas Aircraft turned out C-47 transports, the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Lockheed's engineers perfected the P-38 Lightning, a twin-boomed marvel that could climb faster and higher than anything in the sky. In 1 year, America's aircraft production doubled. In 2 it quadrupled. By 1943 U.S. factories were producing more planes than the Axis powers combined. 3. Confrontation, arrogance meets reality. SFX, radio static, distant air raid siren. In Berlin, reports began reaching Göring's desk. At first, he dismissed them, propaganda, exaggerations, lies. But the numbers were undeniable. American bombers were appearing over North Africa, over Sicily, over the Ruhr Valley. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Hitler's conquests, was now stretched thin across a dozen fronts, defending German cities, supplying troops at Stalingrad, chasing Allied formations across the Mediterranean. Göring's promise to Hitler, "No enemy bomb shall ever fall on the Reich," was unraveling. From intercepted radio chatter to intelligence briefings, the tone changed from arrogance to alarm. The Americans, one Luftwaffe officer wrote, seem to have factories that grow from the ground overnight. German engineers were astonished by the scale of U.S. production. At Willow Run, 42,000 workers, many of them women, assembled bombers with mathematical precision. In California, production yards were so vast that workers rode bicycles from one wing section to another. Meanwhile, in Europe, German cities were beginning to feel the consequences. Daylight raids by 8th Air Force formations, waves of hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, pounded industrial centers. For every plane the Luftwaffe shot down, America built 5 more. The Reich's once proud air fleet was bleeding faster than it could recover. Cut to diary excerpt. American bomber crew, 1943, smiley face. We took off before dawn. I looked down and saw the coast fade into clouds. Somewhere out there, Göring was probably still laughing. But up here were the answer to that laughter. For human element, the people who built the sky. While generals debated strategy, America's miracle was built by ordinary citizens. At the heart of the transformation were women, millions of them, who filled the empty places on factory lines. They were welders, riveters, and inspectors, their hair tied in scarves, their hands blistered from long shifts. The world would come to know them by one name, Rosie the Riveter. Each Rosie had her own reason, some for duty, others for wages, many for family lost overseas. Their stories turned industry into a form of courage. Posters declared, "We can do it," not as propaganda but as a collective vow. Immigrants too played their part. Polish machinists, Italian toolmakers, black foundry workers from Detroit, all joined under the same purpose. For the first time in history, America's diversity became its greatest weapon. In a diary entry from Mary Doyle Keefe, a real-life inspiration for Rosie, she wrote, "Every rivet I drive feels like an answer. They said we couldn't do it. Maybe we can't alone. But together, we're building wings." SFX, montage, factories, train whistles, typewriters, planes taking off. By 1944, the United States was producing aircraft at a pace that defied comprehension. 96,000 planes in 1 year, 300,000 engines, 700 million rounds of ammunition. Every hour, another bomber took flight. Every day, hundreds of crates left for the Pacific or Europe. It was as if the entire nation had become one vast heartbeat, pounding in rhythm to the sound of production. 5. Consequences, when quantity became power. Music builds, military drums, rising brass. The results were staggering. By 1944, America's air fleets dominated the skies. Where the Luftwaffe once terrorized, now it retreated. The Allied strategic bombing campaign crippled Germany's fuel supplies, shattered rail networks, and silenced once mighty factories. Each B-17 formation, stretching miles across the sky, was a flying city, an embodiment of industrial will. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 was made possible not just by courage, but by air supremacy. Thousands of bombers, transports, and fighters cleared the skies for the greatest amphibious assault in history. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the United States had built over 300,000 aircraft, 3 times Roosevelt's goal, 6 times what Göring thought possible. When captured after the war, Göring was shown footage of the Willow Run assembly line. He reportedly shook his head and muttered, That is not possible. No one can build like that. But someone had. An entire democracy had. Reflection, the weapon of belief. SFX, engines fade replaced by soft orchestral score. When the war ended, the noise of the factories fell silent. Workers returned home, assembly lines retooled for peace. But the legacy remained. The American industrial miracle had proven something far greater than military might. It proved that a free people could outbuild a tyranny. That innovation could outlast intimidation. That mockery could spark a movement. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not only on the battlefield, it was philosophical. Its foundation rested on control and fear. America's rested on trust. Trust that a mechanic, a mother, and a machinist could together shape the course of history. In the ruins of post-war Germany, the laughter that once echoed through the Reich Chancellery was replaced by silence and reflection. For Göring's arrogance was not just personal, it was emblematic of every regime that underestimates the quiet strength of freedom. Closing shot, archival footage. Vast American airfields filled with rows of bombers awaiting decommission. A line of B-24s stretches to the horizon. Their engines rest. Their shadows fall long over the tarmac. They are monuments not of conquest, but of creation. Testaments to what a nation can do when it refuses to accept ridicule as truth. This was more than an industrial feat. It was a moral triumph. The power of a free mind, multiplied 1,000,000 times, had reshaped the world. The laughter of Hermann Göring had been answered, not with words but with wings. Slow strings, the hum of wind over an empty airfield. The war is over. The great factories that once shook the earth with motion have gone quiet. Grass grows through the cracks of runways that once launched the storm of victory. In the silence of peacetime, the echo of Hermann Göring's laughter lingers, not as arrogance anymore but as irony, a haunting ghost of a world that underestimated what free hands could build. The camera pans across a vast field of mothballed bombers, wings outstretched like sleeping giants. Their aluminum skins glint under the post-war sun, symbols of a promise kept, a mockery avenged. When Göring scoffed at America's ambition for 50,000 planes, he wasn't just mocking an industrial goal, he was mocking a way of life. He believed strength came from control, from obedience, from fear. He believed freedom was weakness. He believed laughter was power. But in the end, it was freedom that proved inexhaustible. Because freedom gives people something no dictatorship ever can, ownership of purpose. In the machine shops and drafting rooms, in the forges and hangars, in the sleepless glow of Willow Run, men and women were not building planes for a tyrant, they were building them for each other. Each bolt tightened, each rivet hammered, was an act of defiance and belonging. Every bomber that took to the air was a signature of democracy in flight. Cut to archival footage, workers leaving factory gates, waving flags. After the war, America faced the monumental task of reconversion, turning bombers into buses, war engines into washing machines. Many of those who built the arsenal of democracy went home quietly, never calling themselves heroes. But history would remember their work as one of humanity's greatest mobilizations. The total: 300,000 aircraft, over 2 million engines, an economy transformed, and a nation forever changed. The same spirit that filled the skies in 1944 would later send rockets to the moon and satellites beyond the stars. The same engineers who learned to produce wings by the hour would pioneer the jet age and shape the dawn of the computer revolution. The lesson of those years did not fade, it evolved. The assembly line that built bombers became the blueprint for building the future. Music, gentle piano beneath narrator's voice. For Germany, the irony was painful but profound. The nation that believed in the supremacy of order learned, through ruin, that creativity cannot be commanded. In the ashes of war, German engineers, humbled and free for the first time, would help build a new world, not for conquest but for progress. From the same minds that once forged Messerschmitts and Heinkels came innovations in civil aviation, automotive design, and space technology. History, it seems, does not mock, it transforms. The defeated too were remade. In the grand narrative of civilization, the story of Göring's laughter is not merely about planes, it is about vision versus vanity, creation versus control, belief versus bravado. It shows how arrogance blinds even the powerful, and how unity empowers even the underestimated. The factories of America were not temples of war, they were cathedrals of will. Every spark from a welder's torch was a spark of democracy itself, bright, chaotic, unstoppable. Cut to interview audio, 1945, woman worker at Douglas Aircraft. We never thought we were changing history. We were just doing our shift. But when I saw the bombers flying overhead one day, I thought, maybe that was one of ours. Her words captured the soul of the era. Ordinary lives, extraordinary impact. No propaganda, no decree, no speech could equal the quiet resolve of people who believed they could. Visual, newsreel of Göring at Nuremberg, tired and hollow, seated behind glass. The once mighty Reichsmarshal who mocked America's dream faced a tribunal he could not command. His laughter was gone. In its place stood disbelief, the same disbelief that had followed him from Berlin to defeat. He looked upon the evidence of Allied production and said, "This was our undoing." He was right, but not in the way he meant. What undid him was not just the planes, it was what they represented. The limitless strength of a free society when challenged by tyranny. Music rises, solemn strings, steady tempo. As the years passed, those same skies that once thundered with bombers filled instead with jetliners, carrying civilians across oceans once divided by war. The machines of destruction had become instruments of connection. The technology born in crisis had become the backbone of peace. The laughter that once mocked possibility had become the echo of progress. What began as a contest of pride ended as a triumph of principle. Air Force Base, jets in flight, commercial airliners crossing the clouds. Today, every time a plane takes off, whether military or civilian, it carries within its wings the legacy of that transformation. The streamlined fuselage, the aluminum skin, the precision engines, all descend from the innovations of those frantic war years. But more than metal or mechanics, it carries a memory, that when the world doubts, humanity builds. The story of Hermann Göring's laughter is the story of every empire that misjudged imagination. It reminds us that power is not in the command of armies, but in the courage of individuals who refuse to believe something can't be done. It reminds us that ridicule often precedes revolution. That mockery in the right ears becomes motivation. And that the truest measure of a nation's might is not how loud its leaders speak, but how deeply its people believe. They said 50,000 planes was impossible. America built 100,000, and in doing so built something far greater, faith in what free people can do when they dare to imagine. In the end, the laughter of Hermann Göring became the echo of his own undoing. For when arrogance mocks ambition, history sides with those who build. The true power of civilization lies not in conquest, but in creation, and the greatest engines ever built were not of steel but of belief.